the most interesting thing that was happening at the clinics, and we learned a lot about it. And we still at AMBIO have a site that's dedicated for drug detox and can help people come off of fentanyl and all kinds of polysubstance disorders and stuff. It does it like nothing else. One gentleman needed a leg brace. He'd suffered gunshot wounds to the hip and still had peripheral nerve damage that hadn't fully healed. So he had mobility issues and sensitivity issues, and walked out without his knee brace, and then started to get sensitivity back in his foot. But you can see prior to the treatment that there's areas of the brain where there was not blood flow and electrical activity happening. And after the treatment, there's a bunch of stories about guys going and asking the radiologist just for information, try to understand what it was that happened to him. And they were saying that those areas were functioning like normal again.
Raw, uncut, and unapologetic. Welcome to Men Talking Mindfulness. What if I told you there's a naturally occurring organic substance out there that claims to cure addiction, wipe out depression, and ease symptoms of TBI and PTSD, all in just one dose? You're probably thinking I'm full of it and starting to reach for that skip button, but hang on a second, because this thing actually exists. It's called Ibogaine. This isn't just your average treatment. It's a plant medicine getting some serious buzz for resetting the brain's relationship with addiction, depression, and trauma. To break it all down with us today, we brought in one of the top experts in the field, Jonathan Dickinson. He and his team over at AMBIO Life Sciences have worked with hundreds of people, from special operator veterans to pro athletes and high performers who have tried everything else to heal with no luck. Their clients have included some high-profile names like former Texas Governor Rick Perry. Rumor has it that in just one session, it gave him a brain of a 40-year-old. You might have heard of this guy, Brett Favre, or Keith Jardin and Rob O'Neill, just to name a few. So today we're going to dive into the origins of Ibogaine, how it works, and also take a look at a 2024 seminal study with Stanford University and 30 special operator veterans suffering from TBI, many of whom who have had major depression, anxiety disorders, and PTSD, and their mind-blowing results because of Ibogaine therapy. So let's get into it. Jonathan, welcome, Men Talking Mindfulness. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and John, always good to see you. Hey, you want to learn more about what we're doing out there? mentalkingmindfulness.com. I'm just flowing over here, guys.
Oh, well,
right,
I'm just
so
laughing
we're going to do our...
because poor Will has to do that
happened?
intro again. My computer completely went and shit the bed, and Will did this whole intro and reset. So well done again.
I did
Will.
it better this time. Yeah, I know. It's like like a little practice to calm the nerves. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But calm all of our nerves. We're going to do our little one breath grounding practice. So let's exhale out through the mouth. Get really empty. Maybe close the eyes and feel your body as you exhale. Take a big giant inhale into your belly, filling all the way to the top, even into your head. Let's hold that breath for 5 seconds. 4, go easy. 3, 2, 1, and exhale all the way out. Awesome. And hey, everyone that's listening, thank you for being here, for tuning in, sharing this podcast, subscribe, post it on your little snapshot on your Instagram, or you text a friend. And all right, let's jump in. Jonathan, again, thanks for being here. And I thought actually it'd be good just to show people or kind of what the value of this incredible Ibogaine is. We'll talk about the substance itself and how it all works and stuff. But let's talk about that Stanford University study in 2024 that I mentioned in intro. And, I'll just run through some of the results here, and we can talk about like what is going on here. After 1 month after treatment, right, these 30 different operators, this is what they've experienced. So they have an average disability score drop from 30.2, which is actually from mild to moderate disability, to 5.1, which indicates no disability. How about this one? PTSD symptoms decreased an average of 88%, depression by 87%, anxiety by 81%, with improvements in persisting at least 1 month after treatment. And there's also additional benefits as well, cognitive testing, including better concentration and memory, So, and also the treatment was found to be safe with no serious adverse effects or cardiac issues. Only mild symptoms like headache and nausea were reported. So Jonathan, please, like, thanks for coming on the show, and like, what's going on here? I thought we'd just kind of dive right in to the deep end and see how this stuff is working for people.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's worth mentioning from the beginning that while guys are experiencing these kind of major transformations and improvements and all these symptoms that they're reporting while they're going through the experience, this is a powerful psychedelic. Like, this is a journey that guys are going on. You know what I mean? Like when people are coming down to AMBIO, and we're not talking about drug detox, like just, you know, coming in from after combat, or athletes, or guys who are, you know, don't need any help coming off of medications on site or anything like that. They're still staying with us for 5 days. And it's on the second night that they're taking Ibogaine, and they're going through a deep internal journey and life review, and people can see all kinds of things. Sometimes they don't, but there's a kind of an intense psychedelic process that accompanies this. And so it's worth mentioning. You know, because sometimes
yeah, please, like, yeah,
you know, if you're just looking for the outcomes at the end of the day, you got to know that these guys earned it. You know what I mean? They had to go through that process. And the other thing I think that's really important to mention is that we have a lot more understanding kind of emerging about what's actually going on for veterans. And for a long time, I think there was this high sort of prevalence of, you know, discussion about PTSD and like, how are we going to treat PTSD? And it's only much more recently that there's been the ability to even be able to assess and start to understand what's actually going on physiologically in the brain, right? And so, especially with the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, they talk about this signature wound of this global war on terror being mild traumatic brain injury, which can come from being close to explosions, but it can also just come from, and sometimes even more so, just from being around the release of high caliber weapon fire over and over and over, like thousands and thousands of rounds, you know?
Wow. Yeah.
This is cellular damage that happens anytime the head is getting accelerated. And, you know, so you got your skull, it's more dense material, and the brain tissue is softer material. So when things start accelerating, they're accelerating at different speeds. And so that can create pressure between the soft tissue in the middle and the sort of edge of the skull. And that over time can lead to this buildup, this accumulation of cellular damage. And what that looks like is it just becomes harder for cells to function. And so they stop being able to receive the same amount of blood flow and oxygen. And so really basic resources that cells need to just function properly. So a lot of these guys, when they were going through the Stanford study, they were going and getting MRIs done before and after. But you can see prior to the treatment that there's areas of the brain where there was not blood flow and electrical activity happening, or at least dramatically reduced, right? The cells were not necessarily dead, but they were not functioning as normal. And after the treatment, there's a bunch of stories about guys going and asking the radiologist just for information, try to understand what it was that happened to them. And they were saying that those areas were functioning like normal again. And so there's something going on a cellular level with this particular kind of damage. And it just so happens that the symptoms of traumatic brain injury are very similar, a lot of them, to post-traumatic stress disorder and that kind of group of symptoms that we talk about. I mean, there's some other ones that kind of accompany it, like headaches and light sensitivity and things like that are more on the kind of neurological side. But a lot of these things are very similar to what we attribute to PTSD. And so that's why, you know, we're seeing very similar things in athletes, actually. Sometimes I don't think we necessarily know what it's like for guys who are retiring from long athletic careers, especially in sports where they also are prone to having that kind of head acceleration or kind of head trauma or repeated concussions like football and hockey and that kind of stuff. But actually guys are experiencing sometimes some very similar symptoms to guys that are coming out of combat. And so, seeing very similar kinds of benefits. So what we were able to capture in that paper, what Stanford was able to capture, and we were honored to be a part of it, was essentially at first it was just the symptoms, just like the self-reports, like how are guys feeling better afterwards. And there's still a bunch of work to do on the actual imaging to show the kind of cellular results that are underlying that. But that's what we're going to be seeing when that stuff starts to come out.
Wow. Just incredible.
Will and I have done some psychedelic journeys in the past for healing. We've both done psilocybin. Will has done ayahuasca. For those who have listened to our show in the past, we've covered both of those, ayahuasca and psilocybin. We really haven't spoken very much about Ibogaine. I'm very curious about it. If you could, for our listeners and for the two of us, I think Will's probably more educated on this than I am. What is Ibogaine? Where does it come from? And how did people, I guess, figure out that there's this long cultural healing history?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting story how it got to the West for sure, but it originates from a plant, a shrub, the root of a shrub from Gabon in Central Africa. And for thousands of years, at least, people have used the root bark of this shrub for ceremonies of healing and rites of passage. And, they've had an opportunity to witness a lot of very similar things. I've been to Africa several times, and the first time I went, they were trying to explain to me that the gentleman who was closing out his initiatory process that night, who was learning the steps of the dance, walked in on a cane and didn't need it at that moment, obviously.
Yeah. I remember you telling that story, like incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was in Africa. So like that didn't compute until we saw it happen in the clinic.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And then now we have seen that happen with several guys where, one gentleman needed a leg brace that he suffered gunshot wounds to the hip and still had peripheral nerve damage that had it fully healed. So he had mobility issues and sensitivity issues and stuff like that. And walked out without his knee brace, and then started to get sensitivity back in his foot. And then there was another gentleman who had suffered from gunshot wounds to the head and had kind of debilitating light sensitivity and headaches and difficulty balancing, and he needed a cane, and he left the cane with us when he left. So I mean, there's obviously, it's pointing to some kind of physical healing, or that's the way we understand it. But in Africa, I think it was understood in a very different way and contextualized in a very different way, and it was connected with the sort of transmission of cultural values and in the village. And so there's a lot of beautiful kind of structure and poetry that surrounds the use of the medicine. And so, for a long time it was done in secret, but, it started to make its way into the Western world at the turn of the 20th century. And, early scientists were extracting it and stuff. And it actually was used in small doses as an antidepressant in France in the 30s and up through the 50s. And then, they eventually pulled it from the shelves. But it's kind of having this resurgence. And the way that it's kind of blossomed around the United States and in the Americas is in the 60s, there was a gentleman named Howard Lotzoff who was a heroin user in Staten Island, New York. And he was experimenting with different drugs. It was the 60s. And he came across some Ibogaine and took it and realized that he didn't have any withdrawal or any more craving for heroin. And he actually took it quite far. You know, he got, like, by the early 90s, NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, was helping to provide funding for FDA trials. And there was a bunch of different things that happened to kind of coalesced that the trials ended. And that resulted in this sort of underground movement that formed. And so, you know, I'm sort of one of the benefactors of this. You know, we all are now, but I feel like I kind of went down to work with people who had come off of heroin themselves and saw ways to improve upon the care that they'd received. And so it was this sort of peer-driven kind of paraclinical movement that started outside of the United States, like in Mexico, and there was a little bit in Amsterdam and that kind of thing. So that's what was around. That's how people were using Ibogaine for the last several decades. And it's only in the last 4 years or so, as Navy SEALs started to, I guess, end up in straits that were dire enough to go and try things on these kind of fringes, that guys started going down and trying Ibogaine and realizing how much that it changed for them. And it's ever since that happened, things have been going very fast. It's been like wildfire. You know, like the Stanford study took off just a couple years later and started to elucidate all of this. Now, because of the results of that study, there's stuff going on in Texas to try to provide additional funding to drive it forward. But that's really where it comes from. There's a kind of a long cultural history, and the story about what Ibogaine is has changed at different times and in different places for different people.
Yeah. Do you feel it's on the right path now as far as like the story and what it's able to do for people?
I think it's interesting to me, like when I went down to work in Mexico with all of these sort of early Ibogaine providers, I wasn't coming off of heroin. So it wasn't what drew me to it. I mean, obviously it was the most interesting thing that was happening at the clinics, and we learned a lot about it. And we still at AMBIO have a site that's dedicated for drug detox and, you know, can help people come off of fentanyl and all kinds of polysubstance disorders and stuff. It does it like nothing else. But it's interesting to me that the story is beginning to expand and that people are starting to understand that there's something a little bit more fundamental about what it's doing, and that it's treating not only opioid withdrawal, but other things for which we don't have treatments, like traumatic brain injury is a great example. There's nothing really available for veterans who are getting retired with TBIs, or for athletes who are getting retired with TBIs. You know, that's led us to help to explore kind of other uses, like mild traumatic brain injury is sort of on the lower threshold of degenerative conditions that can happen to the brain. But we, you know, when Brett Favre, you mentioned his name, he came down, things had progressed to him to the point that he had Parkinson's, which is a far more advanced neurodegenerative condition. And so we actually have programs too that are designed to help people who have Parkinson's or multiple sclerosis or these more advanced conditions to try to take Ibogaine, and seeing good results there too. And I think, you know, just to properly answer your question in terms of, is the story on track? I think when we call it a cure, I think it's a little bit too far down the road. And I think that we still have a lot to learn to understand exactly what it is and for who it can help. But it's so incredible what it's doing because there's nothing else that's even close. So that's, I think, why that term gets thrown onto it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, after studying for this podcast, listening to your podcast, and you and your two colleagues, your co-founders of AMBIO, really speak to obviously very well. One thing that I thought was very interesting about your own story about taking Ibogaine, I think it was the big dose that you've ever took, you know, was you stated that you started listening to a different voice in your head. And I love to hear about that, but and then we can dive into how Ibogaine helps us to kind of break negative patterns of thinking and chatter and provide us with greater agency over our actions. Let's dive in there. How does it do all this?
Yeah, I think that's I'm so interested in that. I'm glad you asked, because I think a lot of the times the research gets reduced to kind of the cellular mechanisms or the outcomes and stuff. But so because of that, there hasn't been like enough discussion or enough minds kind of thinking about the psychological process that's unfolding. There's a Princeton scholar named Julian Jaynes, and he came out with this theory of the mind that said that actually our ancient ancestors weren't exactly conscious in the way that we think about consciousness, that consciousness hasn't been very uniform throughout human history, that it's changed. And there's been periods where people experience the mind quite differently than the way that we do today. So what he suggested was that prior to sort of the emergence of what we now experience as consciousness, that our ancestors had something called a bicameral mind. And what it would feel like is that there's a voice that we hear that comes in moments of decision stress and tension, when we're confronted with a novel problem that we've never had to face before. And we sort of hear this voice that provides us with the answer, the solution. And that's coming from almost like from outside of us. And then there's the other part of us that sort of receives the instructions and carries it out. And that's where we identify with. So it sort of sounds like there's someone else telling us the answers. And so that would, in James's mind, help to, explain everything from ancestor worship to, the gods to the God of monotheism and the, Christianity. Like this voice would help to puncture through the noise and provide some sense of clarity. And he says that we kind of lost this mind that was sort of split in two chambers as we move towards the frontal cortex and end up with like a different kind of problem-solving mechanism. But, I think maybe in my mind, the way that I think about Ibogaine is our way of solving problems in the world has been so incredible and so inventive and brought us so far, and we're able to communicate across vast distances and to consolidate information from centuries of learning and develop, incredible technologies. But there's certain problems in our life that it doesn't solve well. And that sometimes there maybe are periods where we have to stop trying to solve problems that way and look for a different way of trying to solve the problems of the mind or the problems of the heart or the problems of the soul. And so I think that psychedelics prevent us, not necessarily with a cure to the problem, but with a completely different frame of reference to try to look at the problem in a different way. And the way that Ibogaine does, I think it so frequently puts people in touch with the sense of this other voice that comes through and provides some kind of direction. And anyways, I think that there's still obviously a lot more that can be said about it. And there's some variation in the experiences that people describe, but I see it as potentially helping us to access some kind of ancestral problem-solving mechanisms that usually we just let in the unconscious.
Yeah. We've had Dan Carcillo, the car bomb. He was, I don't know if you know Dan, his work with, he was a 2-time Stanley Cup winner, had to sadly leave the sport at age 30 because he had early on stage dementia from getting in so many fights and had so many concussive and TBI injuries. And, he took his first dose of, big dose of psilocybin, like it knocked him on his ass for sure. And he was in touch with some sort of divine entity that I definitely experienced with ayahuasca and psilocybin. And there is like this, I've heard you say it, and I've also heard it said many times, like Mother Earth or Pachamama or whatever, that's just kind of helping to guide you back to, your compassion itself, like your heart, but also connecting to the collective love and compassion that's kind of out there. And it's really, really powerful. And it's strange too, because you're having this experience, and then it's like, you start kind of hearing things, and you're kind of guided in some way, and know that you're, being taken care of. And it sounds like Ibogaine has kind of that same, infusion of divinity within it, which is just fascinating.
You talked about compassion, and what Will and I understand is that Ibogaine really helps to reinforce the compassion-centered view of addiction. And what I mean by that is, like some experts say that the real question isn't why the addiction, which often gets asked in society now, like, why are you an alcoholic? Why are you using opioids? Why are you using X, Y, or Z? But now, instead of why the addiction, the shift is why the pain. How can Ibogaine help us to answer that?
Well, I think it brings us to that question because it's kind of a perfect medicine for coming off of opiates. Like you were, when somebody's coming in from heroin, they're taking opiates right up to the morning of the treatment. And then they're taking Ibogaine in the night. And then they're not taking opiates anymore. And it's helping it's helping to mitigate upwards of like 80% of the acute withdrawal. But not only that, acute withdrawal is it varies, depending on the body and how we become habituated. It can vary from anything from cold symptoms to quite extreme. But even then, it's several days. That is not the hardest part of going through opiate addiction recovery. The hardest part is the months that follow and the year that follows, of where you still feel like you're dragging ass, and you're still thinking about using, or life still feels like you're kind of chained to the same depression. And I think what Ibogaine does is not only it gets through the withdrawals, but it kind of puts you you're 6 or 9 months up the road, where you can just come out almost immediately with a sense of more or less normalcy. It really does put you in that position where you kind of just have a choice. So I don't know what you would expect from a medicine to do for addiction more than that. Because if you do, you start getting into the, otherwise you're starting to oppress people now, where you're actually trying to control their behavior so much that they don't use anymore. But I think this is the perfect medicine in the sense of recovering that sense of agency, which addiction erodes. It takes away your sense of choice. It is that feeling by the time that you think about whatever it is that you want to do, there's no stopping you. You're already doing that thing. It was reaching for your phone or reaching for a drink or whatever, but there's no way to stop once you've had the thought into your mind. But I think Ibogaine puts you back in the place where you can decide. The thought can come in your head and it has no momentum. You just see the choice as it is, and you can make it one way or another. But I think, even though it does that, people still go back and use. So it confronts us with the problem that you described. Why is it actually that people are using? It's not because necessarily just that they're habituated to opiates that they're using them, but why the pain? What is it treating? And so it sort of forces us, even if we're going to use Ibogaine as a tool, now we have to understand how to approach this question to even do that properly.
It's really powerful. I'm curious, you do a lot of, brain scans around this work, which is, that's, it's pretty awesome to see the before and after, I'm sure. And speaking in terms of addiction, whether it's heroin or alcoholism, Do you see like, pre-scan, before someone comes in, or the studies that you've done where there's like I mean, I'm not sure, I'm just asking the questions, like, is there like an addictive part of the brain that is lit up, right? And then after the treatment with Ibogaine, you can see that activity in that part of the brain like decrease significantly, which gives you that like agency to make that choice you just mentioned earlier. I'm just curious. I don't know if studies have been done like that, but it seems, I'd imagine, like if you're, if you want, you feel the urge, like you just keep going back and using, the body is just like a habit, thing in a lot of ways, and a lot of the habits are obviously in the brain. So are there areas like that that kind of light up in the beginning and then kind of diminish, through Ibogaine treatment?
I don't know, to be frank. We're in the middle of a study right now. Where AMBIO patients are coming down, getting like very similar to the Stanford study, getting scanned before treatment, after treatment, and a month after treatment. And this is for people who are going through opiate detox. So hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit to the questions that you're asking. But in general, I think we do understand the mechanism, or some of the various mechanisms about why it should work. But I don't know. I think that brain science, and I'm not a neurologist, but I do think that brain science is moving away from the idea that things are very targeted and regional in the brain, and more like there's these network effects that are happening that connect various regions at the same time when you're in certain states of mind or whatever. So I think in general, you can see people who have had like sections of brain removed and still are able to do functions that would have been attributed to like that area of the brain. The brain adapts, but I think you do see problems when there's general damage. And that's why, TBI affects like so many things. It almost doesn't matter quite as much where the damage is. Like they even talk about like, no matter where the damage is, it affects the cerebellum and like certain areas of the brain more, even if that's not where the damage is, because things in the brain are so networked and so connected. So, but there's a bunch of ways that I could see where Ibogaine would help. And one of them, like if just looking at like the most extreme examples, is like, we know that there's a lot greater prevalence of overdose than there was before. Fentanyl has introduced an increase in the rate of overdose. Narcan and other kinds of harm reduction measures have helped to make those overdoses less fatal. And so to increase the survivability rate of overdoses more often. Now, the problem is that sometimes when people are going through an overdose, even if they're getting resuscitated, they can experience periods of time where the brain isn't necessarily getting the same amount of oxygen, and you deal with this kind of problem in other kinds of emergencies as well. But if you experience hypoxia because of the lack of oxygen, then the brain can start to have cellular damage from that, right? And so then you start to get into a loop where essentially you're dealing with the same kinds of problems that you see in mild traumatic brain injury and another kind of symptom or difficulty that people want to treat, right? So the fact that maybe Ibogaine can help to generally improve cellular function throughout the brain and throughout the nervous system could have an effect. So I don't know if that's, I don't know if I could answer like in a way that's so like specific about brain regions, but I do think the brain healing effect can help to benefit people in recovery.
Well, let's just get into let's talk about some of the things that are getting in the way of like making this more widespread, or actually of like, let's talk about the hesitations maybe. Like, so what are some of the, the common, misconceptions or fears that people have about Ibogaine, and how would you, address them to somebody that's a little bit hesitant or skeptical about like taking on this therapy?
Sure. So, I mean, for a long time, one of the biggest concerns with Ibogaine was the fact that there's a risk factor and that there have been a number of deaths that have happened because of people going into Ibogaine with pre-existing heart conditions or because they're on certain kinds of medications. And so, when people are coming to AMBIO, we are benefiting from decades of clinical experience and protocol development. And there's extensive measures in place to screen people and monitor them while they're taking it. So, it's something that now we deliver in a setting that functions like a cardiac intensive care unit. Even though it doesn't necessarily look like a cardiac intensive care unit, because we also acknowledge that this is a strong psychedelic journey and it's deeply, deeply meditative, and there's a spiritual component to this. So we make it comfortable and adapt it to that. But the place functions like a cardiac intensive care unit. I think now we can confidently say that we're fairly well aware of how to manage the cardiac risk. There are risks that get introduced if people are using drugs that they don't inform people about, or, other kinds of health issues, like when, all kinds of fentanyl analogs and other stuff started ending up in the fentanyl supply. It introduced a risk factor for drug detox, things like that. But I think there's now good answers to a lot of the concern about the medical risk. And I think that there's several different kinds of medications that can cause issues. And so they range from like antidepressants and psychiatric medications that we just have to ask people to stop before they come down, and like carefully taper off of before the treatment, to other medications that have similar effects on the heart, that could come from various classes of drugs. But, essentially we just need to be very careful that it's not stressing out the liver where Ibogaine's metabolize the heart, and it's not directly affected by Ibogaine. So I think by now we have a pretty good list. There's if clinicians are interested, there's a website called ibogaineguidelines.com, where years ago we consolidated a lot of the clinical experience and kind of wrote up a guideline for how to properly screen and monitor. And so ever since that's come out, the rate of problems globally has dropped significantly. I do strongly believe, because I see it every day, that Ibogaine can be done safely. I think that understanding how to deliver it clinically safely happened around the same time that all the veterans started to show up and to ramp up this interest very quickly. So the timeline kind of makes sense, like at the point where we're ready to explore scaling this, because the safety mechanisms are in place.
Well, good. I'm glad the results that you're having over at AMBIO are just absolutely incredible. And it sounds like you obviously want to take care of your patients and like put all these different protocols in place in order to create a safe place so people can really, fall into this. And it's like, that's one of the reasons we ask this question, or, because there are a lot of skeptics and people that are hesitant out there. And it sounds like it's also being done in such a more professional manner now. I had a friend, like I mentioned earlier, that took Ibogaine, like I think it was like 8 or 9 years ago. And I don't know. Yeah, he said it was over days that he had done it, but obviously he had some really profound results. But there's also a legal thing around this. Like it's, I believe it's a Schedule 1 in the United States. So, let's talk about like the legalities and where can people actually. I know you're in Mexico. This is where AMBIO is, I believe, or one of your treatment centers. You have another one in Malta or something, correct? Yeah.
That's right.
So what's the legalities of it? Yeah.
Sure. So Ibogaine, for whatever reason, did not end up on the United Nations green list of psychoactive substances, which is a sort of blanket listing that becomes the skeleton drug policy for UN countries, right? So most other psychedelics are on there, so cannabis and ayahuasca and the mescaline and peyote and LSD, and they're all listed on the green list. So if you're going to make any changes, it's something that it experiences friction at the international level. So like that was the case with Canada when we legalized cannabis, that there was this international friction that we needed to deal with. With Ibogaine, for whatever reason, it's not on the United Nations green list. So it's sort of up to each individual country how they want to treat it. Unfortunately, the United States made the decision to schedule it alongside a bunch of other psychedelics back in the early 70s. And so it's been strictly prohibited with no medical benefit since then, but not so in other places. So like, in Mexico, it's not prohibited, it's not approved there, but you can work with it without fear of penalty. There's a number of other places around the world where that's the case. And so that's how the professionalism of the clinics has been able to develop and expand over time. But unfortunately, for that reason, it is, unavailable in the United States.
Yeah. Well, I think you mentioned earlier, looking to legalize it, or I just heard you on your podcast. They're in Texas, I think, is one of the first states that they're really trying to legalize it as a therapeutic, because of all the wonderful, promising results it had on, different populations, with definitely veterans being one of them.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, but the fact that it is a Schedule 1 makes that a much more extensive and expensive uphill battle. But this effort in Texas is significant enough that it could overcome that barrier, I think. One of the problems that you have with psychedelics, and so Ibogaine falls into this category, is that they're naturally occurring. So you can't patent them the way that you could patent other medicines. So it becomes less interesting for investors to come in and drop hundreds of millions of dollars to run it through clinical trials, because you just don't have the protection to be able to recover that investment downstream. Like, you go get it approved, and then anybody can kind of come into the market shortly afterwards. So most large investors, and still a lot of investors, are interested in novel molecules. So that, there's companies that are looking at Ibogaine and think they can just make something very similar and it'll be novel and they'll have a patent on it. And so the state money really helps to remove a lot of that financial barrier, right? So, they're still expecting private financing to come in and participate, but it's not at the same level. And it sort of has this promise that potentially other states will come on board and kind of a funding coalition and really help to push things down the lane. So I think that's what's going on. And there is a few other states that are exploring kind of an alternate path to Texas. So like, rather than going through the FDA and trying to get it approved as a medicine, Colorado is trying to do what they did with cannabis early on and just legalize therapy.
Right. It's a plant, right? Just legalize it. This doesn't need a patent or something, right? Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
What about, like, it seems like Ibogaine, from everything you've talked about, and what the studies have shown, is going to be like a major disruption in typical like medicines. I was reading something the other day, I think it was a meme or just like one of those slideshows on Instagram, saying like Pfizer has, they've been around for like 100 and some years and they haven't cured one disease, right? Are you experiencing any resistance from big pharma? Because this is really going to be a major disruptor if you can, get people off SSRIs or, cure their TBI and stuff like that, like, or anxiety, right? All those kind of things that, they're like, they have obviously a big profit model to keep people, on whatever substance they think is not curing them, but like it's definitely helping them in some way. Are you seeing any pushback from big pharma?
No. Yeah, I mean, me personally, okay. No.
Yeah, I mean, not you. I'm saying, like, I guess the Ibogaine as a substance that is obviously having tremendous effects as a way to cure people.
Yeah, I mean, AMBIO is really sort of focused on being a great clinic. And so normally in the process of drug development, you start as a drug developer, and then you have to go through the long process of clinical trials. And by the end of it, you start thinking about how are we going to commercialize this drug and offer it at scale. And I think what AMBIO has the opportunity to do is to play the very important role of trying to understand what it looks like to deliver Ibogaine at scale. Because one thing is, doing the studies and showing that it, works to help to treat these certain symptoms. The other thing is, like, now that you've established that this is actually one of the bit larger complications is how do you deliver it to a large number of people? So AMBIO is very focused on that front. And so for that reason, we're not really in a position where we would experience the pushback from pharmaceuticals. But I would imagine that the folks who are driving things forward in Texas are having to lobby in the same corridors as that very, powerful, well-equipped, well-resourced lobby. So I would imagine that it might occur.
It'd be interesting to see how that takes shape as like this becomes more popular and, and the resistance and like the fucking probably the shit media that they're going to try to put out there, about it and like, highlighting, those few people that have problems like they always do. I mean, it's just really sad, like how they try to protect their greedy profits that, they've proven time and time again that they don't seem to really help a lot of people. Well, let's get into, let's talk about like, what does a typical Ibogaine treatment, like what does a journey look like? I was on your website and you have, treatment can go from like 7 to like 28 days. So, take us through that from preparation, through the experience and then the integrating, all this wisdom afterwards.
Sure. So yeah, to qualify that, when it's 7 to 28 days, that's for drug detox. So
okay. All right. That's what I was looking up, by the way. Yeah, that's what I was looking up because I have people that suffer in my family and loved ones that are from alcoholism. So I was thinking in terms of that, but go ahead. Yeah.
So with alcohol, you're on the shorter end of that spectrum. And in fact, a lot of people, even if they're, experiencing problems with drinking and that's affecting a lot of areas of their life, are able to stop for a short period of time before they come. And in that case, we don't need to deal with it on site. Where we end up having to keep people longer is when they're taking drugs or medications that they can't stop before they come. And so we have to stabilize them on site. So like 28 days is like if somebody's coming in off of Suboxone, which is like a long acting opiate medication, that it really takes a long time to clear out of the body. And it can be, because of that, the withdrawals are also very protracted for people who've been taking it for a long time. But most of that period is just stabilizing and, taking stabilizing medications prior to the Ibogaine treatment. So the kind of foundational treatment that we do, the core one, we have people with us for 5 days. And so the journey looks like, people are applying and then they're starting to work with a coach who helps them kind of think about how to prepare and how to set things up for themselves afterwards. And then they're arriving, we've got obviously in Mexico and Malta, so they're arriving to whatever airport is nearby and getting driven to the center. And then they're there for those 5 days. And the first day is just preparing. We do like hot cold therapy or Mexican style sweat lodge and just try to do something that's sort of physically intense and demanding at the beginning to put you in the mind state of like, okay, we're here to focus and turn inwards. And
I love that. Yeah.
So, it's important. And it's also a very group bonding activity because people are going through as a cohort and there's a lot of support that comes through that. But, you kind of need to find the connection at the beginning of a group process like that. And then we do go through some breathing activities the next morning with people as we're starting to help to prepare people, because you need to have some tools. Like if you're going to be in this intense process, you have to, even if you have them, it's a good time to just check in and remember how powerful the breath is and what that's going to be like. So we do a lot of work to prepare people. The food is good the whole time. They get a massage. We treat people very nicely.
Right.
And then they're doing all the medical preparation, and then they're starting to take Ibogaine that evening. So they're we ask people to prepare, it's called a burn sheets. That's just a list of the things that you kind of don't want to carry forward into your life. You know what I mean? Like things that are blockages that you want to let go of. And the idea is, if I'm putting these things into the fire now, then when I'm laying down into the room, I can kind of start to focus on what's beyond those blockages and kind of inquire about, the way forward. And
right.
so
it seems like it has like also that, I know with ayahuasca, and also, psilocybin, there's like an intention, that can be very helpful when you're moving through the journey. Like you said, it's like, just writing stuff down, and somehow that brings it up into your brain, into your consciousness, into your energy. And, maybe the medicine can kind of work with you on those things when you're in the experience. But keep going. Yeah. Or, sorry to cut you off. I just want to, this is common, but it's interesting, like the power of intention, you know what I mean? And how it really plays out when you're kind of, meeting, yourself, meeting a new entity, or like kind of some divinity that's within this plant. But, just really, really fascinating how, it shows up in more than one, kind of ceremony and medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as physical as this process is, it really does show us the kind of link between the mind and the body. So the mind is, the more that we're able to kind of focus and engage and use the resources of the mind in the process, I think it helps to direct the energy and the flow of all the energy that's going through. Yeah. So then when, after the fire and after the burn sheet, people take the first dose, and within about an hour, they go in and lay down and get hooked up to a heart monitor. And there's going to be a team there the entire night on short shifts because they're up all night. So, and then that's where people go through. I mean, the experience itself really asks you to lay down. Like physically.
Yeah, I remember you saying that's like gravity. You just like, just go like that. It's also like a long experience, like 24 hours or more, right? 36 hours almost, to move through.
It can be.
High dose, is that correct? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe the first like 10 or 12 hours where it's the most intense. And after that point, some people are able to get up and be conversational and go have some breakfast and whatnot. But I'm on the 24-hour train and stay fairly horizontal, even if 12, 14, 15 hours later I make it to my room again, I'm just resting, and really that's no matter what the thing about the next day is, there is nothing to do. It's kind of a forced meditation practice, and the discomforts of that day are kind of like you haven't slept, you're probably tired, and you're in a forced mindfulness practice. As beautiful and as that can be, there's also just challenges to just being that, I think it's like guides us into that, and it's gracious in how it shows us how to just be. But, it's a momentum shift for most of us.
Yeah. Well, I like to, you describe them as your gray days. And it could be like many days that you're just kind of like, from what you're describing it sounds like, you've processed so much through the experience and also changed. Like there's a plasticity element that seems to be involved with this. So, you're going to have a certain number of days. I remember one of your colleagues talking like 7 days it took him after a high dose to really kind of get back to like kind of normal consciousness. Which is really fascinating. I mean, because it sounds like it's deeply, deeply working on the brain in so many different ways that you need these days afterwards that you're not only processing that information and incorporating that information, but your brain is healing and also showing you a new path, it seems like.
Absolutely. I mean, at least it's encouraging to be able to say, but even though it takes, a long time to process the entire thing, it's usually the gray day, and then people are on site for another day of kind of resting and you kind of returning back to normalcy. Like you can be with the group and you're getting back, your diet is kind of returning to normal. You kind of have shared meals and stuff. And the following day, everybody's ready to go home. But you're right. It can still take time to fully process everything. And that's what we want, right? Like, we don't want something that kind of goes in quick and it's a flash in the pan and it, really cool pictures like a Disney movie, and then it's kind of back to normal. What we want is that it holds open this window for very real change. And Ibogaine does that more than anything that I think we know of. There was a study at Johns Hopkins where they called this the critical period after a psychedelic, where there's this increase of neuroplasticity and the ability to be able to learn new things. And, they did this in mice, but it gives you a reference point where, like, ketamine, the critical period was like 48 hours. And then MDMA was like 2 weeks. And LSD was 3 weeks. And Ibogaine, I mean, the line goes up and it goes across and it gets to the 4-week mark, and they just had to stop measuring because they ran out of resources for the study. But it didn't drop off yet because it's long. Yeah. Like, and and it's not because there's necessarily Ibogaine or nor-Ibogaine like still swimming around in your body. It starts this process in the cells. It's in your body. There's this. It creates this openness to change and growth, and so that endures. And so I think that we don't necessarily want it to do that to us forever. Like, what we want to do is find a new baseline, and come back to a new baseline. But it provides us with this opportunity to anchor really big, really powerful changes in our life, right? And so the process on site is 5 days, and there's a couple more sessions with therapists and stuff. But I think afterwards, in a lot of ways, it's really clear to us some of the things that we need to do. Like, we know usually what the good things are, and it's just hard to do them because we get stuck in these patterns, not necessarily as damaging or destructive as an addiction necessarily, but it's the same thing where it's, the train's already left the station. Like, the tracks are laid. Like, it's really hard to shift off course. And here is something that can give us back this sense of agency, just to kind of be very present in the moment and be able to look at the choices. And when we know what the good ones are, usually we gravitate towards. Just to say, it kind of sucks the momentum out of all of the habits and behaviors so that we have that ability to choose how we go forward.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, actually. It's like, habit is just such a motherfucker. You know what I mean? It really is. And it's just, and that's what keeps us in these cycles of thinking, of doing, of addiction, of, bad relationships, of bad choices. And it's just the habits, but also the environment that we live in, and so many different things that, that we learn about here that I try to, improve in my own life, so I can just keep a clear path forward with really what I want to do. But there's also, I know, like, with psilocybin, like, do you have like an integration period afterwards? Like, I mean, like, where you kind of are checking in with people like once a week and just kind of making sure they're, staying on that path, even though the new tracks have been laid, like you mentioned. But some people, if they're in a bad environment, if they're in like a, home that isn't very supportive of this kind of work, is there somebody there through AMBIO that like kind of helps them to just like, hey, check in, stay on the path, how we doing? Like, we talked about this during the treatment and before, and like, are we, stepping forward into those things that we want to be doing? Is that part of your process?
Yeah, everybody that's coming through has a coach that they work with, and that's the idea. Great. Is that you're starting to talk to them beforehand. And again, even before, you kind of know what the changes are that you need to make. And so sometimes you want to front load as much of the preparation as you can, but then, they're continuing to discuss that with you afterwards. And, there's other groups and resources available and stuff. And, I think it is important to be able to have that. And it's important to be able to just recognize what the resources are that we have close by. You know, to kind of finish on that thought about the like laying new tracks, you know, we don't want to necessarily always be, I think the brain is an energy conserving machine. What it wants to do is to have to make less decisions, because that it needs to be efficient with calories and energy. And so we want to automate as much of our processes as we can so that we can focus on what's most essential and what's most important, which is why we end up with all of these automatic patterns and habits. So being in this state of mind where we're being very mindful and we have this like agency to kind of direct even like the minutiae in our life to some degree is a little bit exhausting, because it's demanding that we pay so much attention. And so it really is, I think, about then just setting new habits. It's like, okay, we're going to get back into a little bit of autopilot at some point. So we just want to make sure that we're changing gears. We have time to kind of set up a new pattern and a new habit. And then, you know, hopefully when that automation kind of kicks back in, we're doing things that are better for us, that we have less regrets about, or, you know, need to make such massive course corrections from again in the future.
Yeah. Lovely. And are these sessions guided? You know, like, you know, I know there's music that's sometimes played, you're wearing eye shade. Is the medicine just does its own thing and just like kind of guides you on its own journey? Or is there a mix of kind of someone in the medicine? And, you know, just curious how it all works.
Yeah, no, I mean, in Africa, there's different traditions, and there's, you know, to simplify it a little bit, there's a very old tradition of using very, very high doses. And when you take such a high dose, you just have to lay down, and we'll talk about it afterwards, because there's no way to interact really. And then there is a way of working with kind of lower doses, and then that is a lot more guided. The expectation is that you're present enough to still receive inputs and to be able to share what you're seeing and to provide the confirmation that you're seeing the right things and that you're navigating through. So, you know, I've experienced both in Africa, and I find it really fascinating. But I also think in the West, we don't trust other people that much to be guided, you know? And so what we do at AMBIO is we're working more in the former kind of mode where you're taking a larger dose and it's kind of just between you and the medicine. But we're going to do a bunch of stuff in the front end to kind of explain some of those navigation tools that you can try to use while you're going into that. And that's what the breath work is about, practicing that a little bit and kind of being prepared to go in on your own. And at that point, no, then there's not really a need for a lot of active guidance. The experience really directs itself.
Wow. Is there an intensity within the experience? Like, I know ayahuasca for me has been very intense when you're you know, with high doses of the medicine, and you know, you can fall into the abyss, which can get a little scary, go into the void, and it's just like kind of losing a lot of control, or just, which I think is obviously essential for a lot of these medicines. But are those kind of difficulties come along with a high dose of Ibogaine? Or even like a boost, like you talked about, like or like, you didn't say that word, but that's another way of like taking Ibogaine at a lower dose instead of the flow dose you mentioned, or like another is a high dose.
Yeah, or we call it a flood dose, because
flood dose, not flow. Okay, a flood
point
dose,
where, yeah, there's a point where it's sort of, I think in a nice way, kind of overwhelms you. Like you have to lay down, and there's, you know, focus on completely on what's going on, and so I would say, yes, there's an intensity for sure, you know, and there's a physicality to it. And sometimes people are throwing up and they're not sleeping. But even still, for the most part, for us, it looks like people are asleep, because it really kind of wants you to stay quite still, like in the traditional way, they kind of just want you to have your arms laying at your side, or maybe your hands crossed over your stomach or something like that. But otherwise, like, even if you cross your legs by your feet, like, they'll uncross them. Like that, you kind of, it's like corpse pose, just want to lay like a plank.
Rising
like
of the Dead or something, right? You're just like, coming back to life after like 24 hours of this incredible experience. Wow, that's
but
really
there's this kind of like impulse towards like stillness, and so there's this. It's kind of like controlled intensity, I think, and we don't see people have big emotional reactions to it. Like, they're interiorly, there can be a lot going on, but furthermore, I think that there's this sense of almost like you're just a witness of what is coming up, and so people describe that even to the extent of like, it showed me, right? Or like if they were watching things on a reel, like a movie. And I think the difference is like, we watch some pretty crazy stuff in movies, like that if you were there, it would be terrifying. But we watch it on TV, and even, if you're really into it, you can have an emotional reaction. Even like, I don't know, the first time I watched Game of Thrones, it's like it touched me, or even like Breaking Bad. There was things like when I watched it at that time, it was like shocking and it made me feel something, but I wasn't there. And that's the difference of like just being a witness. And I think Ibogaine the way it wants to like show you things, but you still are, it's like you and this other thing that it's showing you. And so you're still anchored in yourself. You still know that you're in the room, and then you took Ibogaine. If you put your hand up, that the nurse is going to come over and they can help you walk to the bathroom and get back to your bed. And that is so there's this sense of like still being anchored, even if there's intensity kind of being shown to you. And I think that sense of a witness kind of mentality, I think it makes it almost in some ways, and sometimes I'm a little bit shy to say this, but makes it like easier to navigate than other psychedelics. Like, it's intense and long, and there's things about it, but like there's things about it psychologically that make it easier.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I haven't done Ibogaine, but it sounds like you'd be, just lying there and just receiving, really, and just experiencing and kind of witnessing, like you said, which is like, wow.
That's the place to get to.
Yeah. This has been really great, Jonathan. Like, anything like that we haven't covered, do you feel would kind of like put a little bit of a bow on, this wonderful conversation we're having about this incredible therapeutic?
Yeah, I think, we started off by talking about some stuff about symptoms, like PTSD and depression. And I think sometimes we kind of reduce a little bit our experience to these diagnoses. And I think that would be one of the things with psychedelics that would almost be like too bad if it just became like where you go into a doctor's office and write a prescription, like, oh, you got depression, like, here you go take some Ibogaine, I think it really is something that needs to, as much as maybe it has this like flicker of hope, like, it's good to kind of grapple with the fact that it's a journey and to feel called to engage with the whole journey of it, not just the potential reduction of the symptoms. And so, if it is something that's calling to you, I think by now there's so much stuff out there, like guys who have been through, and I'm sure you can find similar stories, but listen closely to like what it took for them, like how they prepared, what it's been like for them afterwards. And, and I think it's really in this kind of like long form and very like kind of personal story that we get to understand a little bit better how to prepare than just, it might treat my XYZ.
Right. Well, also, it seems very promising, as far as like somebody that is battling with addiction, that it really sticks, like you overcome, like I mentioned alcoholism that exists in my family tree, and what are the results? Like, so alcoholism, like it's like a high recovery rate or high sustainability of like, no more imbibing of alcohol down the road.
I think it gives you that sense of agency so much more than any other way that you could approach recovery. It's like it puts you so much further ahead along the recovery process than you could get by any other way. But, like, for example, with opiates, we'll say 100% of people who took the Ibogaine had no more physiological dependency on the opiates.
Wow. Right.
Because it does that. Like that, it does. But it's after that. So I think the people who benefit from the most are like really ready. And so even if it's like something that you want for your loved one, it's like you can kind of put it in front of them and on their path, but they have to go towards it. They have to understand that it's a journey and they have to engage with that. And they have to be at the point where they're going to be able to take advantage of that decision point that it opens up in their life, right? I think it's just important that we look at it like that. And yes, it is something that can treat, I think, a number of conditions. I do strongly believe that's the case. And we need to start thinking about conditions and the recovery from different conditions as a very personal journey that, has spiritual dimensions to it as well.
Yeah. Well, it's also, it relates to what you said earlier about it being a calling. You get really like, that's like the psychedelics. I've taken ayahuasca like 6 times, and it's not something like, oh yeah, fuck it, I'll do ayahuasca this weekend. Like, no. It's like, it is a calling, because I'm part of this group, and they have offerings like every quarter, every month sometimes, they have a center, and I'll be like, no, not ready. And then it's like, 5 years later, I'm like, okay, I'm ready again. Because it's a real undertaking that I think a lot of, like, I'm glad you're describing it. I'm just helping also people to pin it down. Like, it is a journey, but it's something that you have to be willing to do. But going, full steam ahead with it, being ready for the prep work, going along for the journey itself when you're actually, under the influence of within the therapy, but then also doing the work afterwards. And what was so great about as I'm understanding Ibogaine is just like the after effects are just sustaining happier lives. Like, I love you. We said multiple times, you talked about, having a choice, like having self-agency, to make different choices, to live a happier life, to not go back to that darkness by whatever was controlling you before. And it's so, one of the reasons I'm so glad you reached out to us for this conversation, because, a lot of people are suffering, and what it's doing with TBI and PTSD and even like neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's. It's just, it's so wonderful that we have something that is just becoming more and more understood right now, having profound effects on, on basically any life that kind of takes it in. And we're just understanding starting to understand a deeper level of what it can actually do. What does the next 5 years look like? Do you think around this, or maybe 10, as far as what you're going to discover, and then maybe how we can kind of get it into more places and into more people, so we can solve some of the opioid crisis and those sorts of things.
Yeah, there's a lot of tactical problems to solve around sourcing and like scaling clinical operations in a way that it still, feels as whole, as we want it to feel. And I totally see that that's possible. I think it's just going to be a journey and a process. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the media with Ibogaine, and there'll be a lot of regulatory stuff. And there's just kind of a wild amount of momentum. So, yeah, I think we get to see like history unfold. I think over the next 5 years, a lot's going to happen. And I don't know, because all of this has surprised me greatly. I don't know what's possible with it.
Well, I think another addiction that we really haven't talked about is like tech addiction and cell phone addiction.
Right.
I think we have a generation we have a generation of kids, especially Gen Zers and the millennials, but definitely the Z people, that are just like hooked. And their dopamine, is all fucked up. Dopamine levels are all messed up. Like we've had porn addiction specialist on, and I'm sure it can help with porn addiction. I guarantee it can, just from the way, because it is an addiction. And so I'm so glad that, I always feel like it seems like the world is getting more crazy and become more addictive, and people are becoming just, zombies enslaved to the next whatever is put in front of them, that we have therapies like Ibogaine. We have like meditation, mindfulness is coming more on board. Like, eating healthy is becoming more, we don't hear it as much. We talk about it all the time on the show, but to counterbalance all this seeming chaos and addiction and just kind of living in zombie land for a lot of people. So I'm so glad you're doing this work. And where can people find you, and how can people get involved? Like your website is actually very impressive. I fucking love it. I don't know who your designer is, but it's very well done. But how can people get in touch with you?
There's a bunch of information up on the website. AMBIO.life is where you can find it.
And it's AMBIO, right?
AMBIO.life.
.life. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you have a Netflix subscription, which I'm sure a lot of you do, you can go check out the movie In Waves and War, which just got released, and it shows the journey of 3 Navy SEALs who came through AMBIO, and the Stanford study that we've been talking about. It shows you get to see like before and after with a lot of the guys going for their brain scans and talking about it and stuff. So it's a very powerful, very emotional, very beautiful movie. So check it out.
Yeah. And our producer, Michael, hey, Michael, you listening? He'll put that in the show notes too. So you can just go right to the show notes here. And also ambio.life we'll put in there. But Jonathan, congratulations for your own journey, for where it's brought you, where we are here today, the number of people that you're continually helping. Anytime you want to come back on the show to talk about some other results or something else about Ibogaine or whatever else, like you please come back. Like you're a healer, and in this regard, and we need more people like that in the world, and we need to amplify those voices. So thank you so much for coming today and being with us.
Well, thank you, brother. It's an honor and a pleasure. Appreciate it.
And we had John dropped off about halfway, so and everyone for listening, thank you for listening. Share this, someone in your life that's really struggling, with whatever is addiction or neurodegenerative disease. Like, go to the website to really see how incredibly powerful and how it can help so many different conditions. So, and that's a wrap, everybody. Jonathan, again, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, John.
Yeah, you are. Yeah, John. Bye. Wherever John is. Bye. Right. Thanks and peace, guys. Thanks for listening. Peace.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you walk away with some new tools and insights to guide you on your life journey. New episodes are being published every week, so please join us again for some meaningful discussion. For more information, please check out mentalkingmindfulness.com.